final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect man.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, and welcome to Hadith Principles. We are examining the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, learning about its importance to us in Islam, and the great scholarly efforts that generations of our Muslim leaders have applied to protecting the hadith and its sources from any interference or interpolation or distortion, so that no one could add or subtract or alter anything of the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Joining with us here in the studio today, we have our guests. We have Brother Ayman from the United States, and Brother Muhammad, and Brother Hussam from Egypt. Welcome, and glad to have you guys here, inshallah. This will be useful and beneficial for all of us, inshallah. We've been talking about the scholarly efforts of our ulama in examining the hadith and critically, carefully, accurately determining their authenticity. And we talked about that the hadith has two parts. The isnad, or sanad, which is the chain of narrators. It's the family tree of this, or you could say pedigree of this hadith. And the second part is the matan, or the actual text, the meaning of that hadith that is carried. So the matan is the information we need to know, and the isnad is like the credentials of how we know that this is authentic and it's coming from the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing upon him. So we should treat that as a source of our faith and understanding. So the ulama didn't just look at these chains, these people, and accept them, but they looked critically to know who they were, whether they actually met each other, and whether they went back all the way to the Prophet Muhammad, through a companion, through the next generation, the tabi'een, and that each person in that level actually met and knew and narrated hadith from the person above him, going all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. There's another thing they need to do. Even if those hadiths are muttasal, musnad, they are in a complete chain, or the family tree is complete in every level, going back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. They also, in order to increase our confidence in the hadith, they study all the different isnads of that same hadith, the same matan that has the same meaning or approximately the same meaning, talking about that same subject, and they look to see how many people are narrating those hadith to us. And so if they find that many Sahaba narrated that same hadith, and many tabi'een, many of the second generation learned that hadith from the Sahaba, and that in every level there are many, many different people, that increases our confidence in this hadith, that it's impossible, it's not physically possible that all of those people who actually were scattered all over the world, and in fact to journey from one part of the world to the other, even from, say, Medina or Mecca to Damascus or Baghdad or Egypt, was a long, hard journey. It would have been impossible that those people would have all gathered together and say, let's forge this hadith and let's make it up. And then they would have all agreed about its wording and its meaning, and then they would have foisted this lie upon the masses in the Islamic world. And so I may meet a very honest person and I trust him and he tells me something. But then if 10 other people come and tell me the exact same thing, I'm going to be really sure that's true. And so if one person tells me something strange, I might have a doubt. But when many people tell me something I didn't know, I'm going to be very confident. And so we call that hadith mutawatir. And so hadith mutawatir is the hadith in which there are many narrations on every level going back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Now, in fact, mutawatir hadiths are considered by the scholars of fiqh, the scholars of Islamic jurisprudence, to be the sources of qat'i knowledge. That is, it's absolutely certain and indisputable. And so that is considered by the majority of scholars to be a source of the major principles and practices, beliefs of Islam, that those are indisputable hadiths, and so they are a foundation for our Islamic knowledge. And so when we hear basic hadiths narrated by tawatur, which is the narration of these hadiths by many different people on every level, we can't really question their authenticity in any way. And so our basic Islamic practices, our basic beliefs in Allah and the angels and the Day of Judgment and the description of heaven and hell, the prophets and their scriptures, and our basic practices, the 5 daily prayers, fasting the month of Ramadan, zakat, pilgrimage, the recitation of the Quran, all of those we know verbally, mutawatir, in every level, going back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. Some of these hadiths have been narrated by so many people that it is without doubt that they are authentic. For example, the hadith, whoever invents a lie and attributes it to me, the Prophet is saying, whoever lies about me intentionally shall prepare his seat in hellfire. That hadith was narrated by 62 companions of the Prophet Muhammad, each one of them to many different students, going all the way down. Many of the other hadiths about meeting the Prophet at the Hawd, at the basin of in paradise, that we will meet the Prophet ﷺ, inshallah, to be among, if we're included among them, of the true believers. The first place we'll meet him is at the basin of water in paradise. That we raise the hands in the different positions in prayer, at the beginning of the prayer, but also in rising from the bowing, the ruku', and in other parts of the prayer. That you can make in wudu. If you wash your feet, then you put on your socks or boots, something that's covering your ankles, and then throughout the day and night for 24 hours if you're at home, or 72 hours if you're traveling, you can only wipe upon them instead of taking those socks or boots off and then washing your feet. So that is also mutawatir, it is narrated by many, many, many companions and to every generation. That the Quran was revealed to us in Saba Ahraf, in 7 different modes of recitation from the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. And every intoxicant, everything that conceals your memory and makes or your judgment and interferes with your mind so that you cannot think clearly, every intoxicant is khamar, or is the wine that is forbidden in the Quran. All of those are mutawatir hadiths. Other hadiths that are not on that same level are called generally by the ulama or the scholars of Islam khabar al-ahad. That is hadiths that are narrated by one or a few people in at least some levels in the chain of narration. That doesn't mean those hadiths are not authentic. They're hadiths narrated by trustworthy, reliable scholars. And so most of the sahih hadiths in Bukhari and Muslim and the other sources are not mutawatir. But those hadiths are generally relating to the detailed, secondary level of knowledge of the details of our beliefs and the details of our practices in Islam, not the foundation. So our basic foundation, arkan of Islam, our basic beliefs and iman, our basic practice, our basic practices and our basic beliefs, arkan iman, and other major Islamic teachings are known by very, very wide sources. A hadith that is less than that is called ahad. and the majority of scholars accept those hadiths, and they are authentic. And so the hadiths that are muttafaqun alayh, the highest level of authenticity, the majority of those hadith are ahad hadiths. And so in Islam we accept them. If one sahabi came to you, are you going to say no? Of course not. And there's a proof from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. In the Quran, in chapter 2 of the Quran, Allah changes the qibla, the direction of prayer. And so He tells us to turn away. The Sahaba were praying toward Jerusalem, and He said, turn to the Masjid al-Haram in Mecca in prayer. And that happened while some companions were praying in some of the mosques near Medina, such as Masjid Quba. Sahabi came to them, to the door, and said, the Prophet Muhammad has received revelation to pray toward Mecca. And so immediately, they were praying in the midst of prayer, of the Asr prayer, the mid-afternoon prayer, and they turned completely around from Jerusalem, turned all the way around 180 degrees to pray toward Mecca. They didn't say, oh, bring more Sahaba, we don't believe you. And so we believe one Sahabi. And then among the Tabi'een, there are righteous Muslims who are honest and trustworthy, and we believe them. And we believe a Muslim brother who is known to us to be faithful, is not known to lie, and is trustworthy. And so most of us learned basic beliefs and practices of Islam. Maybe we had one teacher, or we had a few teachers, and they told us. And so we accept those hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad that are ahad hadiths, inshallah. We're going to go for a break, and we'll be back shortly. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Tomorrow on Huda.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Hadith Principles. We're talking about the way that the scholars of Hadith examine the chains of narrators. And one thing is they look for how many narrators are bringing us this Hadith. And when we find large numbers of narrators on every level, we're very confident of the authenticity of that hadith, and it's called mutawatir, and it's considered indisputably correct source of basic teachings, practices, and beliefs of Islam. But any authentic hadith, even if it is not on the level, if it's ahad, it's not on the level of tawatir, but it is authentic, continuous, going back to the Prophet Muhammad, is acceptable for us in our beliefs and in our practices of Islam. But normally those hadiths are dealing with the details, not with the very basic beliefs and very basic practices that we know as Muslims. So they are complementary and add to our depth of knowledge, but they aren't normally the foundation of our Islamic beliefs and practices. And so there are very many mutawatir hadiths, but they are the minority. Most hadiths are not on that level. Some things, they came from many Sahaba in different hadiths in meaning, but not in the actual words. So we call that tawatir bil ma'na, that its meaning is very widespread. It's continuous and widespread at every level, but they're not exactly the same hadiths, but the basic meaning of those hadiths all is in agreement. So for example, we have the hadith about the end times, Masih, the coming of Dajjal, the Antichrist, the coming of Jesus Christ, the coming of Imam, a righteous Imam or well-guided Imam who is a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the end of time and will be a just ruler. Those are mutawatir in their meaning. There's so many hadiths, but the details of those hadiths, there are many details which are not in that level. So one hadith gives you one detail, and so it may not be on that highest level. But when you put them all together, you get the basic meaning of what is going to happen in the Day of Judgment. Also, for example, the punishment in the grave. Some people think that, well, it's not fair. Why would Allah punish somebody in the grave? And the fact is, the Prophet told us, in so many hadiths tell us that we will be punished in the grave for sins that we committed and we did not make up for those sins or make tawbah nasuh, sincere repentance for those sins in our lifetime. And so Allah may torment the person in the grave. Also the shafa of the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, in the Day of Judgment, that he will have the shafa on behalf of all human beings, that to end the day and the great, horrible day of judgment is so long and horrible for people, and they're so full of fear, and they beg the Prophet to intercede on behalf of the whole world, and for his ummah, his followers, to intercede for the sinful people of his followers, that they will enter paradise, and they will all enter paradise with the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him. All of those are narrated in widespread, very many different sources, so that you can't dispute that those are basic beliefs of Islam, inshallah.
Can you please review of what we learned today?
Yeah, well, let's talk about that again very shortly. It's not always, we don't always have to write them, but these words are foreign to people, and so we do need to write them sometime. Mutawatir means what?
Many narrations.
Many on every level. So here's the Prophet, many companions, many students. How many? Different scholars say many things. So from the companions, it doesn't have to be so many, because their companions are all assumed to be truthful and honest and righteous. But in some levels, some people say 5, some people say bigger numbers. In each level of this hadith, we find many, many narrations. So that is considered hadith mutawatir. So it's called a tawatur. Tawatur is this characteristic of being continuous chains which are numerous. Multiple chains in every level. If it's broken at some level and there are fewer, like only one narration of a hadith, if there's only one, it's called gharib, kind of a strange. It's called, strange. But it doesn't mean it's not authentic. But if there's other hadiths that carry similar meaning, of course, it will be considered authentic. But when there's only one person, it's considered gharib. And if it's only, say, like two, few people, it's considered aziz, a kind of a dear hadith, a kind of rare hadith, inshallah. But the majority of hadith also, I forgot to write that, the majority of hadiths we have, they're authentic, but they're not mutawatir. They are called ahad. And our scholars of belief, aqeedah, and scholars of fiqh, jurisprudence, accept ahad hadith. That means authentic hadiths, even though it's narrated by only one companion or a few companions and a few of the next generation. It's no requirement in Islam that everybody narrated every single hadith. But some companions narrated certain hadiths. They didn't narrate others. It didn't mean that they weren't authentic hadiths.
Okay, now for daif hadith, can there be mutawatir for daif hadith?
That's very interesting. Actually, they're considered, sometimes they're widespread in the later generations. So it's not tawatir, because it has to be in everyone. Of course, the companions never would narrate a weak hadith. And so if the weakness has to come later than the companions. And so the weakness in the hadith comes from certain individuals. So they're never tawatir. But what happens is they become widespread in later times. And so later times, everybody is narrating these hadiths that are weak or fabricated, and they're very popular on the alsana, on the tongues of people, and they're well known among people, but they're not tawatir. They're well known only in later times, not by the early generations.
Do gharib and aziz refer to mutawatir, or
no? These are hadiths where a gharib hadith is where at some point there's only one person. So at some point below the Sahaba, there's only one person. And so this hadith, if it contradicts other hadiths that are well known, it won't be accepted because there's only one person. in that chain. And so, but very often they are not contradictory to anything. They're not contradictory to the Quran or other hadiths, and so they could be authentic hadiths.
Can you clarify the difference between gharib and ahad?
Ahad are any hadiths that are not tawatur. Any hadith that is not mutawatir is an ahad hadith.
Okay.
That is the majority of hadith. That is, they are narrated by one or two or three people at different levels. And so some levels, it may be mutawatir in some level and not in others. A famous example, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Actions are by intention. That was only narrated by Omar, nobody else of the Sahaba. And so it is very kind of gharib at that first level. And then it became well-known and mutawatir almost, and all the other levels. And so it's a very well-known hadith below the level of the tabi'een. But in the first levels, it was only from one person. So it's a kind of example of you call kind of strange, very rare hadith.
Now, why would some people try to fabricate hadiths?
Well, of course, we're going to be talking about fabricated hadiths more in depth in later episodes. But some people had, for example, their own political parties. And they were fighting in the Islamic world over who should be the leader. And they would fabricate hadiths to try to say that the Prophet Muhammad supported them. So for one time there was, for example, fight between the Abbasids, Bani Abbas, and the Prophet and the Umayyads, Bani Umayyah. And so the Abbasids were descendant of uncle Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, who was the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So they would fabricate hadiths giving him Abbas's son, Abdullah ibn Abbas, things like that. The Shiites would fabricate hadiths about Ali and Fatima, and they would fabricate things against Sahaba like Abu Bakr and Omar. And then some people thought, well, the Prophet is the wisest person in the world. So they would say all wisdom is from the Prophet, peace and blessing upon him. So if they heard any sayings, good sayings, or amthal, or parables, or stories, they would attribute that to the Prophet, knowingly. And then sometimes people heard stories that were full of wisdom. They may have been from other prophets, or they may have been just from wise people, and so they would mistakenly think those were hadiths of the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him. The Prophet was a human being. He didn't say everything. He sometimes didn't speak unless it was necessary. So there are many wise sayings that don't go to the Prophet. So they could be true. They could be true in meaning, but they don't actually go to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him.
Yes, excuse me, sir. I have a question regarding today's classification and the classification of the last episode.
Mm-hmm.
Today you came to know that traditions may be mutawatir or ahad.
Mm-hmm.
But last episode your Honor said that traditions may be regarding the as I was writing them, that may be more regarding the narrative, the narration itself, the chain of authority.
Yes. Well, the ulama look to different parts of the isnad. The isnad is the authority of this hadith. And sometimes they're looking at the individual people. Did they meet each other and know each other? And so is this tree or chain going back to the Prophet, is it actually complete and linked at every stage? And so then it's a complete isnad. And so it's musnad, because we know that each one met the other one and narrated from the other one. And so the hadith is called musnad, and if it's broken, it's called munqata', it's cut. And so then that wouldn't be an authentic hadith. While today's episode, we're talking about how many people narrated this hadith. And so when more people narrate it, it sort of strengthens it and makes us even more sure about its meaning, inshallah. And so all that should just give us confidence in the great efforts that great minds in Islam have worked hard over centuries and centuries to preserve the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, for us, and to guarantee that no interpolations or additions or subtractions or inconsistencies can be introduced into the teachings of Islam. May Allah Almighty increase our faith and our ability to practice Islam sincerely by our study of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Barakallahu feekum. Allah bless you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect man, sending his word across the land, leading only by his sunnah and the Quran, the word of Allah. He brought the answer to this cruel world, our beloved Prophet Muhammad.